Trek to Yomi is a beautiful and engaging game, and it's one that I feel is deserving of much more praise and love than it initially got. It sort of feels like this game isn't mentioned enough and is, in my opinion, very underappreciated. From its absolutely stunning environments and scenes to its engaging combat, this game really has it all for me. On top of that, samurai stuff is just cool as hell. This game is a combination of 3D environments and traversing the land with more side scrolling linear combat, though. The combat here is sort of Souls like, almost like a side scrolling Sekiro, but not quite as hard. However, the game does have difficulty settings, including a one hit kill mode, which I have not been able to beat, so the challenge is there if you want it. The game opens up with a young child, and it's our main character. His name is Hiroki, and he's training with his sensei. This training acts as a sort of tutorial on the basic combat. The game uses a parry and block system that may feel familiar, where you time your parries just right and it leaves your opponent open for a counter. Or you can just block, but that will deplete your stamina bar. On top of the blocking, the combat has different combinations for attacks, such as holding up or down while attacking or stringing together other combinations to make even longer, more devastating attacks. Eventually, our master is called away for an emergency. We decide to follow him through our village, and this is our first look at the very much alive environment. There are many citizens roaming around, performing various tasks and having conversations with each other, and they often actually address us and are interactable. This world truly is beautiful, and the team did such a fantastic job with the art style here. As we approach the main gate, we start to hear screaming, and someone yells that there's bandits approaching. We find some dead bodies of locals, and this is where we get our first taste of the combat. There's a health system here where you can only take a certain amount of hits before you get brought back to the previous checkpoint. And there's also a stamina bar, as I mentioned, which gets used up when blocking or performing certain attacks. So you can't really just button mash here. Initially, the only thing I didn't like about this game was the turning around. You have to actually press a button to turn left and right, and it did get a little frustrating and it was hard to get used to, but there actually is a way to fix this later on in the game. And I do believe that this could actually turn some people off of the game. Just it felt a little clunky at first, but eventually, like I said, it gets easier and there's a way of turning around later on by combining it with attacks and parries. One thing I do love about this game though is the camera angles. It's often pretty far in the distance away from the action, and it kind of acts as a different perspective than you'd typically expect. This really immersed me in the game, and it made the world feel just that much more alive. We run through some more bad guys on our way to find our master, and I actually did get unalived multiple times during the first few fights until I got used to the combat. But once you do, it feels very satisfying and pretty smooth overall. We make our way to a bridge where a bandit stands in our way, and he tells us that he'll send us to Yomi, which, by the way, is a Japanese word for the land of the dead, and this will be important later on. As we progress, we come across shurikens, which is a ranged weapon that can be used to temporarily stun enemies, do a little bit of damage, and I found these fun at times and definitely useful against other ranged enemies. We get a kind of pan out over the village, and we see that the entire thing has been set ablaze. The bandits are burning everything down. This is where we get introduced to environmental kills. Occasionally, we can use objects in the surroundings to take out multiple enemies at once. This is a fun little touch, and you don't really necessarily have to use it. You can always just take on the enemies one on one with your sword. Throughout the game, you can also find upgrades to your health and stamina, which will definitely come in handy as we face tougher enemies throughout the game. And I feel like the game gives you enough upgrades as you go. It gives you enough stamina upgrades, enough health, and combinations of attacks as you progress. One thing I have to emphasize is how satisfying the combat felt for me. Timing a perfect parry to leave your enemy open to an attack just felt so good. And I found that button mashing doesn't work. The enemies often block your attacks or step out of the way. This results in a sort of chess match where you have to time heavy attacks and stabs and slashes and parries all together. This also really shines during the boss fights, where it truly felt like a chess match. As I progressed through the game, I was often presented with multiple paths to travel, and I found almost always if you took the alternative path, you were actually rewarded with things like ammo for your shurikens or upgrades to your health and stamina. This game really rewards you for exploring. Once we reach our destination, we run into our first mini boss. As the surrounding area burns to the ground, we're presented with a fairly tough fight. He often counters very quickly, and the only way to take him out is to learn his patterns and then time your parries accordingly. We eventually strike, and with our katana in hand, we actually cut off his nose. He knocks us down and has the upper hand, but before he can deal a lethal blow to us, our master steps in and saves the day, striking down our enemy. But in the process, he succumbs to his own wounds. Our master makes us swear to protect our people and to keep his daughter Aiko safe. We make the promise before he eventually dies, right in front of both me and Aiko. We get an awesome transition of our character, showing that we're now in the future, when he's an adult, followed by the game's title screen. This game really does a good job with the aesthetics. We're then shown a group of individuals, and they're talking about a warlord that is quickly tearing through the land nearby, burning villages and towns as he goes, and they're planning out their defenses and how they're going to counter it. But they're interrupted when a man approaches the gate of the town, and he says that the enemies have actually reached the nearest by town, causing destruction and so much death. The enemy is near, and they have less time than they initially thought. So we eventually set out to the neighboring town and get ambushed along the way, and eventually have to make the trip alone because all of our comrades have died. Along the way, we solve some small puzzles, which is kind of a recurring thing in this game, and we fight a lot of enemies. During the game, as you slay more foes, you do learn more combos to use in combat, as well as some finishing moves when an enemy is stunned or injured. There are actually quite a few combos in this game, and it took some time to learn and memorize them. It felt really good to actually use them, though, and it kept the combat fresh. Although I did focus mainly on about 2 or 3 combos at a time. And eventually we reach another bridge, where we get a sort of mini boss fight. The enemy is armored, and we must use piercing attacks as well as finishing moves to defeat him. They're sort of stepping up the difficulty with varying enemies. After some exploring and fighting, we reach what is my favorite upgrade in the entire game, and I actually believe it should have been unlocked from the beginning. It's an upgrade to the parry that will automatically turn your character around if attacked from behind and if you time it correctly. This makes the game much more smooth, and it really helps with the difficulty of turning around manually during combat. As I travel through this game, I really fell in love with the environments, and I've mentioned it a couple times, but this game truly is beautiful. Every scene made me want to stop and appreciate just how good it looked. It felt like sort of playing an old samurai movie. So I often found myself just kind of enjoying the ride and just looking at all the landscapes and environments. It really made me appreciate the art style. We eventually reach another mini boss, and this fight is no easy feat. We have the main bad guy with a spear. He has range and is very quick to counter attacks, but on top of that, as you damage him, he calls in reinforcements that you have to eliminate before you can actually attack the main guy again. This didn't really seem fair, and it took everything I've learned so far to end up victorious, but I actually did perish here a few times. Once we defeat him, he tells us that while we were here fighting and being distracted, his master attacked our village and that we left it unprotected. We have a sudden realization that we did, in fact, leave our village unprotected, and we turn around and run. We have to go help those that we swore to protect. We're brought to a cutscene, though, between Hiroki and Aiko, and they seem to be close. She rests her head on his shoulder, and we ensure her that we're there to protect her. And we again promise to always be there. It seems like these two are in love. We then flash back to the present, and we arrive back at our village. It's on fire. There are many dead and injured civilians strewn about. We left them unprotected. We let this happen. As we fight our way through the village, we're introduced to another new enemy, the archer. For these enemies, you have to utilize either a parry or a roll to dodge the arrows, and it adds just a little bit more complexity to the combat. Once we do eliminate him, though, we are actually given the bow to use as a weapon, and this is actually pretty fun. They are similar to the shurikens in that it's very useful against ranged enemies, but they can also be used to inflict damage on some of the more difficult enemies, like the ones with the long pole staffs or spears. There's also this really cool scene that I just really wanted to point out, where archers are volleying arrows at us from the background while we fight in the foreground. It just adds a layer of depth. It's just another way this game utilizes the combination of 3D and 2D. As we progress, we get new combinations to unlock, new upgrades, and some new enemy types like this guy with the long pole. They can actually be quite tough the first time you meet them. We make our way through the village, filled with many enemies to strike down, and I'll show a quick little compilation of just how awesome these scenes are during these fights. And eventually we reach the leader. It's the man from before. The man that tried to kill us as a child. The one that we cut off his nose. But our master struck him down. How could this be? How is he alive? He tells us that in her final moments, she cried out for us. He killed Aiko. We're presented with a very tough fight here, one which you're actually supposed to lose. However, in my very first playthrough, I actually did enough chip damage to defeat him, and it gave me a secret ending. I actually thought the game was over, and I was quite disappointed because it was very short, but then it kind of just travels you to the next area anyway, and there's actually a lot more to be played. The intended way to progress, though, is just losing this fight. We get struck down by his blade, and it fades to black. We get a vision of Aiko tending to our wounds, and we tell her that we're nothing without her. She tells us that we must never lose each other. We eventually awake on the ground and see Aiko a little ways away, but she's walking away from us. We start to follow her, but something's wrong. We ask a local woman if she saw Aiko, and she says she did, but that we should tread carefully as these are cursed lands ahead. What did she mean by that? This land does indeed look very different, and then we see why it's corrupted. There's a new type of enemy. These characters are like zombies. They are called blighted. One major difference in the combat is that these characters don't get staggered by our normal attacks. They just swing right through them. So this changes the rhythm and timing of combat quite a bit, relying more on parrying and timing the strikes accordingly. These guys are freaky, and it was quite fun to have the style of combat get changed up on me. It was something I wasn't used to. We slowly make our way through the strange land, fighting off more blighted and ultimately looking for Aiko. We then run into a samurai, and when we address him, he tells us to not act as if we're one of them, and that we're a liar, and he says we have no honor. We don't recognize him, but what did he mean by all this? Why would we have no honor? Aren't we a samurai? We keep on moving and solve a few puzzles, kill a few more dozen blighted, and eventually reach another bridge with another samurai. We tell him that we follow the same code, but he also calls us a liar, and he says that we're soaked in the blood of innocence. We tell him that no one we've ever killed has been innocent, but he also calls us honorless. After fighting these samurai, I just got to think, what did we do wrong? Why were these souls blaming us for everything? We do continue on and run into another samurai with a similar interaction, and also many more blighted, until we get a cutscene, and we run into an old friend, one that we saw get slain, and he actually blames us. He says that they all died because we abandoned them chasing for glory. We were chasing the warlord master instead of helping the people we swore to protect. He tells us that we betrayed our vow. And then they attack us, and we do what we have to do to survive. There's a long stretch of just exploring and fighting more blighted until eventually we see Aiko again, but she vanishes before we can reach her. She's leading us somewhere. But where? At this point in the game, I really wanted to know what was going on. The story was gripping, the mystery was unfolding, and the combat was becoming very fluid and quite satisfying. I felt like a real samurai, except my character seemingly did something wrong and left us without honor and broke our vow. This game was great, and I really felt like I had mastered the combat. I was doing really well. And then she arrives. Oh boy. This boss fight is hell. She has long-range attacks, quick speed, and attacks that rain down from the sky, and I'm not ashamed to say that I died here quite a few times before eventually slaying her. It took a lot of practice. Once we eventually slay her, we are presented with a ghost form of Aiko, though, and she tells us that she belongs in Yomi now, and that she can't refuse this. We tell her that we failed her, but now that we're here, we can stand by her side as well. She tells us this can't be. She says, not yet. She tells us that her killer still lives and that countless souls will die if he's not stopped. And we have to make a choice. We can either stand by her side, tell her others need our help, or that the warlord must pay for what he's done. I decided to choose to stand by Aiko's side, that my promise to her will remain. She tells us that we must first ascend into the land of the dead and face what's there, that we must face a challenge. The next area is very cool looking, with bridges and statues reconstructing themselves through solving puzzles and very large open areas. It's very different from the rest of the game. As we travel through the land of the dead, we meet a spirit who tells us that they know what we did, that they all know. They say that so many souls have been sent here because of us, and ask how we will atone. And then they attack us. This seems to happen a lot in this game. We continue to fight spirits and progress through the puzzles and even another mini boss. There is a long section here of just traveling and fighting, so I'll show a couple cool scenes I really liked, but then I'm going to skip ahead. Eventually, our character says out loud that none of this would have happened if he just stayed to protect the ones he loved. Aiko wouldn't be here, and neither would many of the other souls. He blames himself. We then find ourselves in a weird shape shifting building fighting more spirits and other enemies called shades. These enemies can teleport behind you. It's actually quite fun to fight them. Until we reach an area with an old nemesis of ours. The enemy that first told us how his master destroyed our village while we were distracted by fighting him instead. He tells us that we left them all to die. And we tell him that his death was not one that we regret, and we call him a demon. But he says that we're all demons down here. We eventually fight him again, and this time he's much tougher. With his long spear and ability to call in backup, he takes quite a bit of doing to get his health bar to 0. But we do eventually defeat him, and he tells us that we can't bring her back, and we can't undo our failure. We continue on our path, and our character shows that he's driven by his love for Aiko. He reassures himself that he will face any challenge necessary to find her, any challenge that Yomi can throw his way. After many more fights and a few puzzles, we reach a sort of gate. It appears to be a portal to somewhere else, and we step through and we're met with an absolute tank of a boss. He tells us again that we've abandoned our code and that we let everyone we love die. We again state that we were deceived and it really wasn't our fault, but I think our character is beginning to believe it. This fight is quite difficult as the boss has a wide variety of attacks and he's very quick, and he also has a very large health bar. I did eventually defeat him, but it took quite a few tries. Even with all the upgrades and combos I had, it was still quite the task. Once he's defeated, we get a vision of the spirit of our old master. We tell him that we failed him and that Aoki is here with us, here in Yomi. We ask for forgiveness, and he tells us that he doesn't blame us for what happened, but that even in death, we're not released from duty. We must stop the bandit warlord. We are again presented with a choice. I decided to choose I will find a way back during my first playthrough and promise to stop the warlord. Our master tells us that our final lesson lies ahead. We then get transported to an area that is just littered with human skulls. They're all over the place. And we eventually reach a spirit, and it asks us why we do what we do. And we tell them that we must stop the warlord, and in turn, the spirit says that we would leave our beloved to face eternity alone. We tell them that we're honor bound and that we do what we must. The spirit tells us that we'll be breaking a vow, but then opens a path for us to proceed. I fight my way through more enemies and many dark landscapes until we reach the top of the mountain we've been climbing into a very large building. We solve a couple puzzles that block our path, and the spirit tells us that there can be no shortcuts if we wish to reach our goal. There isn't really much to talk about here besides the ever-changing landscape, the beauty of it, and as we get teleported between different areas, it's a lot of fighting and a lot of puzzles, but not really much in the way of story, so I will skip a little bit ahead. As we approach the end, the spirit tells us that blind duty makes us a slave, but we're determined to leave this land and return back to our home world, the land of the living. We eventually fight a spirit that appears to be ourselves. It's a mirror image of us, and he tells us that we have to accept our true selves, to accept who we actually are. After some fighting, we defeat him and tell him that this is not who we are, and we won't accept it. We see a vision of ourselves as a boy who asks us who we are then. And he says we're divided and unbalanced. And this is why we couldn't defeat the warlord. We're too split. We're too divided. He tells us that love, hatred, and duty are all binding us, but they're pulling us in opposite directions. We need to make a choice to show what truly guides us. And we're presented with another choice, but this time I chose love. Love was what started this journey, love for Aiko. We're bound by her love and the duty to protect her. Our character apologizes to his master and says that others must take his place, and we quickly stab him through the chest. He then fades away. Our younger self tells us that Yomi grants one last breath, and then we have to return to Yomi to remain for eternity. We wake up back where we were previously when we first got mortally wounded. We're alive, and we have one more task to complete. We must take down the warlord. We make our way to the burning building which holds our nemesis, fighting through dozens of enemies, and nothing will stop us from seeking our revenge. This village scene is really awesome to look at with all the fire, explosions, and just generally the way it looks. We eventually arrive to the warlord, and he says that he sees we've been on a journey, and that whatever we think we learned won't be enough to stop him. He plans on killing us again. We tell him that we would die 1,000 times for Aiko, and he responds that one more will be enough. This is similar to the boss fight earlier where we were meant to lose, but this time it's a little easier as he takes a little bit more damage than before. I did still lose here a few times as the fight is still quite hard, but it's a little easier than before. We eventually defeated him and tell him that Aiko was waiting for us, and he responds with, "So that is what you chose down in Yomi's depths. No doubt you agonized over it, tore yourself apart, and then stage 2 of the fight happens." This time he calls in backup. He has fire powers and is more resistant to damage. Overall, the fight is quite difficult, especially when you get surrounded by multiple enemies. I was seriously not expecting a second stage for this boss. After a long, drawn out fight, we eventually best our rival, but this time for good. We tell him that his fate will be a lonely oblivion, and that Aiko is waiting for us, and that his greed got him nothing. We fade to black and come back to our character finally meeting up with Aiko. Despite his mistakes and breaking his vows for selfish reasons, he's finally back with the one he loves. And they touch hands and then embrace each other. They will spend eternity in the land of Yomi together, forever. This is where the game ends, and I just really wanted to cover this game because it's truly one of my favorite out of nowhere games where I just stumbled across it and took the plunge, and I came out loving every minute of it. It's one of the most beautiful games I've ever played, and the art style here is really something to marvel. I think the developers did a fantastic job through and through, and sure, it may lack some depth in the combat, and perhaps it might get a little repetitive, but it's a short experience, and I believe it's one worth experiencing. So yeah, if you ever see this game on sale, maybe pick it up and give it a try. I would say it's worth the ticket. And as always, thanks for watching.